Oh, welcome everybody. Today we're going to talk about, you heard in the keynote, he talked about lack of monitoring. Well, we're going to talk about an area that involves everybody because, face it, you can't surf the web if you don't do DNS. I mean, most people don't remember IP addresses, especially with IPv6 now. So we're going to talk about how the attacks have been evolving and becoming much more sophisticated, if you will, specifically targeting ways to use that vector of using DNS to get into your network. So I'll give you a little background on myself. Like Brian, I've been doing this forever. I've been in security since security wasn't a thing with the internet. You know, the internet wasn't there when I started. Been doing lots of things. I've got patents on security. I've got written cybersecurity books. Pretty much everything you can think of evolved from pen testing, and now I'm actually doing malware research. There's lots of different things, but as I said, the problem just keeps evolving, keeps changing. It's not going to go anyway anytime soon. Keeps us all employed, but I wish it would get a little bit better. So we're going to start a tag team our presentation today. We're going to cover the evolution of it. So I'm going to pass over to Edmund, let him talk about where he started and what he does, and then we'll get into some of the cool stuff.
Yeah, thank you, B-Sides Belfast. So my name's Edmund Brumaghin. I'm also a security researcher with Cisco Talos. So just a little bit about me. I love malware. That's what I do. Day in, day out, neck deep in malware, figuring out how it works and how to make sure our customers are protected. So I've been with Talos for about 3.5 years. Prior to joining Talos, I spent the prior decade doing digital forensics, incident response. I've held pretty much every role you can hold in a security operations team, protecting critical infrastructure, so nuclear energy, power generation, financial services, high tech, before coming over to the research side. Also, as a hobby, I'm super into music. That's kind of the thing that I like besides security. So what are we going to cover today? So we're going to start out with kind of a crash course on the DNS protocol and how the specification works. We're not going to dissect like the RFC or anything super boring like that, but we're going to cover some topics that are relevant to how attackers are abusing this specific protocol to compromise organizations. We're also going to talk a little bit about how you can detect this sort of malicious activity, how you might be able to put security controls in place to help make sure that you're not compromised, and if you are, you're able to at least detect it. Just a show of hands, how many people are actively monitoring the content of DNS queries and the associated responses coming in and out of their network? So a few. Yeah, I talk to a lot of organizations. I talk to a lot of security professionals, and that's kind of a weak spot right now. Everyone's good at monitoring HTTP, HTTPS, some of the more conventional protocols, FTP, SMTP. But not a lot of people actually are monitoring the contents of the DNS traffic that's ingressing and egressing their network. And then we're going to talk about ways that you can defend against this sort of abuse. So let's start out with that crash course. So DNS, right? I'm going to date myself a little bit. I still remember landlines, and when you didn't necessarily remember everyone's phone number, you had to go into a big yellow book, and like you'd remember their name, and you'd have to go see what number you had to dial on the phone to like actually reach them. So DNS is very similar, right? You enter a rememberable address into the address bar in your browser, and DNS is responsible for taking that and converting that into an IP address that you can then route to access whatever content is hosted there. So that's kind of how that works at a high level. But when you really think about it, there's a lot of moving parts in DNS that makes that name resolution possible. So with a lot of the attacks that we're going to cover today, I talk to people, and one of the things that I hear a lot is, well, we don't allow our endpoints inside of our network to communicate to DNS servers directly. Well, that's not necessarily a protection against a lot of the attacks that are making use of the DNS protocol, because when you think about it, if you've got an endpoint in your environment that is trying to reach, server XYZ, domain XYZ, hostname XYZ, they're not reaching directly out to that name server. They're typically going to request resolution from a server inside your network, right? Your DNS servers. And those DNS servers are going to go upstream to your ISP's DNS servers, which are then going to go upstream even more, and they'll eventually reach the name server that's responsible for the namespace of the domain that you're trying to resolve. So attackers are leveraging this because it doesn't require any sort of direct command and control or any sort of direct communications from the endpoint to the attacker-controlled server. They're basically hopping through legitimate infrastructure. So if you're relying on a firewall blocking, UDP or TCP 53, not necessarily going to help you in this case, because they're just going to leverage your legitimate internal DNS servers to facilitate that connectivity. So we're going to talk about a few ways that attackers are actively leveraging DNS to successfully compromise organizations. A lot of organizations have gotten much more mature in recent years as far as detecting abuse of FTP, HTTP, SMTP, but they're not necessarily looking at DNS in the right way. So what we're seeing is adversaries are starting to tunnel malicious code through DNS TXT records, basically leverage DNS for command and control protocol to facilitate the execution of arbitrary commands on systems, interact with shells, things like that. We're seeing that through TXT records, A records. We're actually seeing attackers start to abuse the inherent trust relationship within DNS itself and targeting the core internet infrastructure that's responsible for facilitating DNS for the internet to continue to work. So let's talk a little bit about DNS tunneling. So most people are pretty familiar with protocol tunneling, right? If you use a VPN to connect to your organization's network, you're using protocol tunneling, right? You've got a VPN tunnel and you're tunneling traffic, HTTP, HTTPS, other traffic through that VPN tunnel. So protocol tunneling is pretty common, and it's possible using the DNS protocol as well. You can tunnel other protocols, typically custom designed protocols, leveraging DNS communications. So a practical example of this is DNS tunneling to bypass captive portals, right? So when you think about, Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi in a coffee shop or on an airplane or in other scenarios, a lot of times when you connect to the wireless network and you're doing your thing, you can actually load the website that allows you to put your PII in and your credit card information to get free Wi-Fi or to get Wi-Fi. And if you try to browse to other websites, typically they're not going to work, right? It's going to tell you, no, you don't have connectivity to the internet. But one of the things you'll notice is that in a lot of configurations, even in those scenarios, DNS works just fine. So there are applications like a couple of the examples on the screen where you can leverage DNS tunneling to facilitate connectivity to the internet without having to actually pay for it or enter your credentials or enter your information into the captive portal, because they're filtering HTTP, they're filtering HTTPS, they're filtering all these other protocols, but DNS is not filtered. And that's one of the weaknesses in a lot of organizations' security postures that attackers are actively leveraging. So I want to talk a little bit about TXT records. So TXT records are an interesting element within DNS, right? Everyone's used to like A records, CNAME records, things like that. TXT records are pretty interesting because they're used really commonly nowadays. When DNS first came about and when TXT records were first a thing, they were typically used to append information about different assets that an organization might be interested in. So you'd have a DNS record and you put a TXT record that says this is Jim's server, or this server is located in data center XYZ. So it's effectively a record that contains text, contents, that gives you information about an asset. So nowadays, they're used for a lot more than just that sort of thing. They're used for a lot of security relevant functions. So when you think about SPF, Sender Policy Framework, or DKIM, or DMARC, these are all technologies designed to secure mail flow, to protect from phishing that may be targeting your brand, things like that. And so they're really regularly used. They're very, very common in a lot of organizations nowadays. But they're also able to be used to facilitate the transfer of information from an external server to an internal asset, all leveraging DNS. So I want to talk about a DNS tunneling kind of case study, and this came about back in I think 2017. And this was a malware family that we discovered that we refer to as DNS Messenger. It's a pretty interesting example of how this sort of TXT record is being leveraged to facilitate command and control. So in this particular case, it started with a tweet, right? So we had somebody tag us on Twitter, and they were like, well, somebody doesn't really like SourceFire much, and they pasted a snippet of PowerShell. And inside the PowerShell was a base64 encoded blob you can see on the screen, and when you decode that, it says SourceFire sucks. Well, we kind of took note of that because if you're familiar with Cisco, right? Cisco acquired SourceFire. So, we saw that and we were kind of interested to see where exactly that was. What was that relevant to? So we started trying to figure out exactly what we could, to figure out where in an infection chain this was. All we had was the base64 encoded blob and this snippet of PowerShell. We didn't have any other IOCs. So a researcher and myself, we basically started looking to see if we could reconstruct the attack that was associated with this string. And we were actually able to reconstruct this using a lot of open source intelligence, and we were able to basically tie this back to the initial infection vector associated with DNS Messenger. And DNS Messenger was actually being transmitted and distributed via mouse spam campaigns. So they were sending targeted phishing emails that contain malicious Office documents. And an example of one is on the screen there. You can see it's a malicious Word document. One of the interesting things they did was they used McAfee's branding inside of the maldoc. It's pretty similar to what you see a lot with mouse spam campaigns, right? They put a decoy image in and they say, hey, enable macros, enable content so that the attacker's code can start to execute and it can facilitate the infection process. For a lot of organizations, McAfee may be really common, right? What if you use McAfee on your endpoints? Most of your users are going to be super comfortable seeing a McAfee logo and trusting it. So this was actually the first stage of about a 4-stage infection process that was really interesting because it leveraged a lot of techniques that are commonly associated with fileless malware. So the only way that this particular malware family would actually leave artifacts on a system was if they chose to achieve persistence during stage 2. So when you open the Word document and you enable macros, basically VBA macros kick off that extract and start to execute a stage 1 PowerShell routine. That inside of that PowerShell routine contains stage 2 that's encoded. They decode that, and then they do a check to see if they should enable persistence. So should they persist across reboots? So every time you reboot a system, malware kicks back off. And so if they chose to do that, they would either write the contents of stage 3 of this malware into the registry, or they would write it to an alternate data stream. So not your conventional file storage of a malware payload. They were using non-traditional ways to facilitate that persistence. So persistence, as I mentioned, was acquired during stage 2, and it was responsible for going out, retrieving stage 3, and then if necessary, if configured properly by the attacker, would basically store stage 3 in a non-traditional way so that each time the system was rebooted, the stage 3 PowerShell itself would be extracted from the registry, kicked off, and then executed on the system. So stage 3 was responsible for retrieving stage 4, and that's where DNS really came in to the equation here, because stage 4 was delivered using the contents of DNS TXT record responses. So let's look at how that works. So effectively, the way that this works is inside of that stage 3 PowerShell, they would basically look at an array list of domains that the attacker controlled the name servers for. And so they would pick one of these domains and they would go out and they would retrieve, they would make a DNS TXT record request. And the response of that record request, as you can see in the bottom of the slide there, actually contained encoded PowerShell commands. So it was basically PowerShell that was encoded using base 64. So the malware would kick off, it would go out to an attacker-controlled name server using that normal DNS hierarchy. It would basically just say, hey, I want a TXT record associated with, subdomain XYZ of one of these domains, and then the response from the attacker's server would just be transmitted through that hierarchy back into the internal DNS servers and then forwarded over to the endpoint. And what it would do is it would basically take that base 64 encoded blob that it received inside of the DNS TXT record response, decode it, and then execute it within the confines of the existing PowerShell process that was running. So what this stage 4 would do is it would actually execute the Windows command processor, so cmd.exe, and it would redirect standard in, standard out, and standard error into the PowerShell process itself. It would select a second domain from a list, another array list, and then they would basically leverage a custom command and control protocol that all made use of DNS TXT records. They would send a send message, await a response, and then they would send the output of that to send the output of the command line processor over standard out and standard error using DNS record requests. So just to kind of illustrate that, so when I say SYN, I don't mean like TCP SYN packets. This is actually what they called that stage of the command and control protocol. So SYN would be used to basically stand up the command and control protocol, and then message queries would be used to facilitate the transfer of information from an infected endpoint to an attacker-controlled DNS server, all over that DNS TXT request and then associated response. So you can see the message query itself. The query is from the endpoint. So the endpoint saying, hey, please resolve the TXT record associated with this really long string of alphanumeric characters. But when you actually decode that using the encoding mechanism that they were using, what they were basically doing is they were sending requests for DNS TXT records, but when you decoded the contents on the attacker-controlled server, it was the output of the Windows command line processor. So the responses from the server could be used to say, hey, go execute this command on a Windows endpoint, and then the output would be sent back over that DNS stream. And this kind of just shows the command and control protocol that was being leveraged by the adversary. So SYN would stand up the C2 protocol. They would just do that message query and response as long as the attacker wanted shell access to the system. And then when the attacker was done controlling the endpoint, they would send a FIN query and a FIN response. And they actually created a full custom command and control protocol for this, and you can see kind of the packet structure that they created for this particular command and control protocol. So that was the initial campaign associated with DNS Messenger. A few months later, we actually detected some additional campaigns, and they were actually leveraging an updated version of DNS Messenger. So once again, mouse spam campaigns. In this case, they were making them appear as if they were from the Securities and Exchange Commission, the EDGAR system. If you're not familiar with it in the U.S., the SEC has the EDGAR system that allows companies to make filings and put in the documentation they need to. So they basically spoofed SEC, sent emails in that said, hey, you know, there's important information from the SEC, open this attached document to find out what it is. So when you open the document, they actually branded it to make it appear as if it was, associated with the SEC. They put the appropriate branding and whatnot in there. In this case, they weren't using macros, though. They were using a dynamic data exchange, DDE, which is a feature set that was present in Word that attackers were abusing pretty heavily. So when you open the document, it pops up. It says, hey, this document links to other files. Do you want to update the document? And if you say yes, that causes Microsoft Word to go out to the predefined resource on the internet, pull down contents, and then start to execute it. So in this case, if you clicked yes, what it would do is it would call the Windows command line processor, which would then call PowerShell, which would echo sec.gov in a little window on the screen to make it look legit, right? And then it would basically go out to a compromised Louisiana government website where they had been hosted the next stage of the infection process. It would pull down the contents from that URL, that trt.doe.louisiana.gov/font.txt, and then it would execute it on the system. So when you actually go out to that and pull down the contents associated with that external resource, I truncated it for slide's sake, but what you would get is PowerShell, and inside that PowerShell was a base64 encoded blob. So that base64 encoded blob would then be decoded and then executed within the confines of the existing PowerShell process on the system. And it was responsible for storing stage 2 in the Windows registry, similar to what we saw with the previous versions of DNS Messenger. It would also check to see if it was already running. So it would check to see if a specific mutex was present on the system. If you're not familiar with mutexes, they're pretty common ways for programs to avoid executing multiple times on a system. So they would check to see if this mutex was present. If it was, that meant that DNS Messenger was already running on the system, and they would just terminate execution. If it wasn't, it would continue to kick off and go into later stages of the infection process. So stage 2 persistence was crazy. So they had a bunch of different ways that they could achieve persistence on an endpoint. So this is just a screenshot of some of the ways that they could attempt to do this within the Windows registry. So there were a lot of if-then statements present, and based on the results of those operations, they would make a decision on how to persist on the system. So they could write to a bunch of different locations within the registry to store that PowerShell blob that would be kicked off every time the system was rebooted. So in addition to the registry, they also had the capability of creating a scheduled task. One of the interesting things about the scheduled task, this is pretty common with malware, right? Scheduled task points to malware code. Every time the system reboots, malware code kicks off and the infection continues. But in this case, they actually set a random delay. So they had a random delay set up so that each time the system rebooted, a different amount of time would pass before the malware would kick itself back off, which is kind of interesting if you're running this in a sandbox environment, or if you're just trying to analyze it. You might look at it after a reboot and say, well, nothing's happening, but the reality is there was a wait timer set. In addition to the registry, in addition to the scheduled task, they also had the capability of using alternate data streams or WMI subscriptions in the Windows Management Instrumentation database on a Windows endpoint. So these are a couple of non-traditional ways to persist on a Windows endpoint. They could create a subscription in the WMI database and then leverage that for persistence as well. So stage 3 was pretty interesting. So this is where the command and control protocol would really kick off, and they would start to reach out to an attacker-controlled server. And the way that they would determine, how to operate is they would obtain the system serial number, and then they would generate an MD5 hash of the serial number. They would take the first 10 bytes and use that to generate a DNS hostname that they would use to communicate out to an attacker-controlled name server. So what they would do is they would take that host name, They would basically append a hard-coded string. In this case, it was stage. Then they had a counter set up that would iterate each time a DNS request was made. It started with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And then they would randomly select a root domain from an array list similar to what I talked about in the last version of DNS. And that's the host name that they would use to create DNS requests for, to request that name resolution. So just as an example, that's an example of one of the host names that they would attempt to request name resolution for. So they would first request an A record, and then they would take the IP address that was returned from the name server associated with that A record, and then they would request a TXT record. And they would take the first part of that TXT record, and they would perform a cryptographic operation on it. They would perform the same cryptographic operation on the A record, and they would compare the values kind of as a data integrity checksum, if you will. So you can kind of see here, so you've got an A record that returns an IP address. They perform that cryptographic operation on it, and an integer value is returned. And then they do the same thing with the TXT record, and they compare the two integer values. That's that data verification. So in this particular command and control protocol, if the integer value matches, that means that, command and control is good to go, and they would take the rest of the TXT record contents and they would store it in a variable. And then they would iterate the counter, and they would make another DNS request. It would return base64. They would perform that data verification, and if it matched, they would take the rest of the TXT and they would append it to the end. And they would just keep building this blob of base64 encoded information. They would then basically wait for the process to either fail that data integrity check, or if 0.0.0.0 was returned from the attacker-controlled server, that meant that the transmission of information was complete. And the resulting base64 encoded blob is stage 4. They would decode that, pass it to PowerShell, and execute it to initiate stage 4. So stage 4, it was a rat, basically. It functioned as a remote access Trojan. You could execute arbitrary commands. It would use DNS to retrieve what commands to run on the system. Based on the contents of those DNS query responses, it would execute those commands, and then it would post information. This time they actually leveraged HTTP for the data exfiltration. And it functioned pretty similar to what you would expect from rats. So I'll pass it over to you.
Okay. So you see, they started taking advantage of DNS. And anybody who's been in this business knows these guys love to see what their peers doing, so they keep adding to it. They keep changing. We saw DNS Messenger evolve from one that was easy to see on the names to one that was a little harder to look at. Well, now we're going to look at DNS espionage. Warren and Paul did a great job finding these attacks when they first came out. And this was probably about a few months later than, basically like near November, October of 2018. They came across DNS espionage. And this first attack actually had two different components. The first part we're going to look at was a rat, similar to what DNS Messenger was, where they were trying to get remote access to a box. And what was really interesting is that, they started like everything else. They could do spear phishing, but they also had some other interesting techniques. They were going for tricking users. Users are that one of those weak links in our networks. So instead of just doing phishing emails, they would also go to different social media sites like LinkedIn, places that people may be looking for a job, and they would actually put interesting links up there that sort of confused a regular user. Most people don't understand how DNS works, so Wipro.com, Suncor.com, those are valid companies that actually hire people. Well, hr-suncor.com, it's not really related to Suncor, but it looks that way for a regular user. So if I put that up there, you're likely to download the file. Well, when you download it, it looks like a regular document. It has information to fill out like I'm getting a job. But as usual, since it's an attacker one, they put some macros in this document. So in this case, they actually put two different macros. One macro would execute when it first opened up, and all it would do is copy a copy of the document down to the system named doc. Didn't look really suspicious. But then when you close the document, another macro would execute and actually do some other things on the system. You might wonder, why'd they put two macros on this system? What they're doing is they started realizing that the defenders know, or should they, we're trying to always defend against these attackers out there, but the attackers know that we're putting roadblocks in their way. And one of the things they know is that most people now have incorporated some type of sandboxing, some way to check to see if a file is malicious or not. Well, they also know a lot of sandboxes aren't the same. Well, if I have a very simple sandbox, it's going to open up this document, and see if it does anything. Well, in this case, if all you did was open it and you don't actually close it in your sandbox, you never did the malicious part. So it looks pretty benign. And you go, okay, it's fine, let it through. So they're trying to do some avoidance of those sandboxes that they know are in place on all of our networks. But if you did actually close it, then it would actually kick off the actual malicious stage of this payload. And in this case, as I mentioned, it was trying to get a remote access Trojan on your box. Well, those Trojans need to communicate with the command and control. Well, we see it could do HTTP. We've seen that over the years. Nothing really unusual, nothing new. But these attackers also had the capability to take advantage of DNS. So if they were going for, say, a higher value target, maybe one that they knew was really monitoring HTTP really well, they could actually use DNS for their entire command and control. And in this case, they actually went a little bit more, a little different than DNS Messenger. Remember DNS Messenger was using those text records, which they're becoming more common, but you could still look at the text records. Well, in this case, these guys went straight for regular DNS-A records. So what they would do is they would create a domain. Again, you have to develop some type of a domain. Well, they created one that looked like Office 360. They replaced the O with a 0, the 0 with a little O. Quick look at it, most people are going to think it's Office 360. And then they needed to create a subdomain that went with that domain. Well, in this case, they didn't want to repeat their domains over and over again. So the blue part that you can see, they just randomly generated some information so that each time they would get a different subdomain. And then the gray part, they were actually encoding essentially the ID of the system. So for this malware, each individual system was given a 2-character identification value. Like in this case, it was GT. So they basically base32 encoded that into the gray part, created that domain, shipped it off through DNS, went all the way to the attacker's name server, and they got a reply back of 0.1.0.3. Not really a valid IP address. DNS doesn't care as long as it's 4 octets of numbers. But in this case, it's actually telling the malware on the system that I'm sending you one command, and it's going to be 3 characters long. So the malware goes, okay, I'll reissue my DNS command. And again, the gray part stays the same. The blue part, which is random, gets something different. But if you'll notice, we have a different IP address this time. We have 100, 105, 114. Well, if you look at the ASCII chart, they basically encode the results of what they're trying to do. The 100 is a D. The 105 is an I, R. So it's telling through DNS the malware that I want to run a directory on the system. So they could send whatever command they wanted, and then they would execute a bunch of DNS requests going back again, given the results. This time, that gray portion was going to encode pieces of the result. They again kept it small because they know if they get too large, just like the original DNS Messenger, it's real easy to spot programmatically. But here, as long as they keep it fairly small, it's much harder to detect. They're staying in the noise, and now they're transmitting all their information over a protocol in many cases that aren't even monitored. And that's one of the advantages they were looking at. They were really trying to stay under the radar. And when we saw them do this, we could look in Umbrella and the Investigate tool and see when they were using this, but in reality, they didn't use it in that many cases. They really used it for more of the high-value targets. It wasn't something they went to on a regular basis because they knew, again, the more they used it, the more it was likely to get detected, and then people put more roadblocks in place to stop it from working in the future. And that was the first half of it. But these same threat actors also had another component that they were using to try and get into the networks. So instead of trying tunnel stuff through DNS, what they also realized was that when you do a DNS request, you see the blue system here, we know we got to get that IP address so that we can actually communicate with the real server. But they also knew there's this entire DNS hierarchy that facilitates giving me that IP address. So they're like, well, what if I go and target that infrastructure first? So what if we switch it around so that if I hack the DNS infrastructure so that when the IP address comes back, it's not the company's website, it's my attacker-controlled website, I can now become a man in the middle for the actual traffic. And if I do that well enough, I can steal credentials for the users for that company and then go directly to the company with valid creds. So a way to really target a company in a much more stealthy mode. When you look at the hierarchy, there's lots of different tiers to this. And that's one of the things. In this case, these guys were literally going just for the registrant accounts. Because what they realized is that a lot of people have set up these domain accounts. They may have said it a long time ago. They have a really weak password on their registrant account. If I go in and hack that account, I can easily change where it's pointing to, and now I become a man in the middle. I can actually steal credentials, get right onto the networks. It made a pretty interesting attack. So that's what we're going to talk about for this second stage of DNS espionage. That's what these guys actually did. They went out, they set up their own servers. They picked their own IP addresses they had. And then they were actually putting self-signed certs on a lot of these so they could make it look like legitimate host. So if you went there, it actually had a certificate. A lot of users don't know the difference between self-sign and regular sign. But then they would create the domains and then basically redirect the A records. And again, couldn't put the domains when we first did this because they were actually validly still targeting these companies. They were like, military, government sites, oil and gas, certain Middle Eastern countries. But we could actually track this through passive DNS to see that they were redirecting valid requests for that site to the attacker-controlled server. And then what was really interesting is they would let you put in your credentials and they would happily redirect you to the real site so that you would actually be logged in to the real company after you gave them the information that they were looking for because it was their site first. So that was what we first noticed. Then actually stepping back, we saw that this wasn't just happening near the end of 2018. It had been going on for a couple of years. So these guys were taking advantage of a situation where people don't really look to see that the IP address from my A record is actually getting changed. They're not monitoring that. Just like we don't monitor DNS on our network, we don't always monitor what's happening on those name registries either. And they took advantage of that fact. So they were actually doing that to target networks. So again, as I talked, they keep evolving. In this case, it was significant enough at the time that in U.S., Homeland Security actually sent out a notice to all of the government agencies and said, hey, we want you to go and check your registrant accounts, make sure you have a very strong password. If you can do two-factor authentication on it, set it up, whatever you can do. But we feel that they're going to start targeting those registrant accounts for all the government organizations. So they really pushed it in the U.S. to try and get people to make sure that they knew that they had strong accounts that weren't going to be hacked. I don't know if they were really successful, but we'll see as time goes on. But now we move even further to, I think this was like beginning of 2019. We started seeing attackers that were taking it actually to the next level up. These guys went solely for targeting that DNS infrastructure and doing it with more of a clear motive of espionage. I mean, they were targeting really high-value targets. Think of governments, intelligence organizations, military. But one of the interesting parts is they really went up higher in the food chain. So they were taking over like name servers. In some cases, they were actually taking over like top-level country domains. So, hey, why go for the low guys when I can control all the DNS for an entire country? Which makes it really scary. Because if you think about it, on these situations here, these guys were pretty skilled at what they did. But DNS holds the internet together. If somebody goes and tries to repeat this and makes a mistake, they could wreak havoc and destroy the operation of lots of activity on the internet when nothing would work. And that's one of the scary parts is that these attacks are getting involved, and as people start repeating that, they may or may not have the skills, but they can get in and then wreak havoc that they wouldn't think about. And in this case, there was obviously the primary targets, these military sites, these government organizations, but it also involved secondary targets. Because if you think about it, a lot of these registrars were even in different countries. So to get to my final target, I had to compromise that part of that infrastructure, that DNS setup. And those registrars may be in totally different countries, but that's what they were targeting. Because they realized that maybe this government entity has very strong security. They really take security seriously, But what about the registrar that provided them that account? Maybe they have some weaknesses. They haven't patched something. They may have ways I can get in. And that's what they started taking advantage of, the fact that there's lots of areas, almost like a supply chain, if you would, that I can take advantage of not going directly to that company. As you can see here, primary targets there in orange, but the secondary ones were those registrar accounts or registrar entities, registries that were in different countries that they also took advantage of, because that's what was supplying the name servers that these guys actually took control of. And in many cases, they actually stood up their own name servers. So instead of just redirecting a single entry, they were actually redirecting an entire name server and other spaces so that they could pretty much put whatever they wanted. And they would do it short, long term, it depended on how long they wanted to do the change. To give you an idea how this worked, these guys would go and target one of these registrars, one of these registries, find a way to get in some initial access. They maybe even spearfish somebody that works for a registrar. They would get in, start moving around, get more access. They would get, data back to their command and control. Pretty much once they would get in far enough, they would actually control some part of this DNS registry so that they could actually then do that changing the name name server, IP address, do whatever they needed to, because they were actually on the systems that could control it now. So now they would do it, update whatever entry they wanted. Maybe it's for your company site. And now whenever someone goes to that valid company site, they're getting redirected to the attacker's controlled name server, attacker's controlled DNS server, however you want to put it. And then, obviously, depending on how sophisticated they were, when you connect it, sometimes they'd have self-signed certs. Other instances here, one of the interesting things that they would also do is that all the people that generate certificates, these companies are not all created equal. Some of them do less authentication than others. And in this case, a lot of times they would see who you had your certificate with, and then they would go to a competing certificate registrar, if you will, the ones who issue the certificates, and actually request a certificate for this company's site. And in many instances, there wasn't enough checking done that they actually had a valid cert for your domain. So when they stood up their fake server, it looked totally legit. So obviously they would let people come in. It looked pretty, legitimate. People would log in, give their credentials. They'd pass you on to a legitimate site. But now they actually have actual credentials for the targeted network. So they could come in really under the radar because they're not even trying to break in because they have valid credentials to start with. One of the things that was really, I want to say, interesting and sort of scary at the same time when this one happened. Most of the time, whenever we find these new attacks, we'll publish about it on our blog. We'll let everybody in the world know about it. And most of the time, the attackers, when they see that, will sort of back off. They'll take a pause and go, oh, people are watching this. I'm going to scurry into the dark. I don't want to be seen. When we published on this one, these guys didn't cool off at all. They sort of increased what they were doing. They could care less. They were just like, we don't care. We're going to keep doing what we're doing. So they were really scary. It was one of those that they were aggressively going after their targets, and they could care less whether people talked about it or publicized it at all. They were still going to keep doing their targeting, which was really a scary thing because we hadn't seen that in the past. Most of the time, they'd always at least cool off for a while, but this time they didn't pause at all. They just kept moving forward with the attacks that they were doing. And, I mentioned they did different certs and things, but one of the really, things that they really came across here was, that was the other side of it, being able to make it look legitimate. They didn't just pause at redirecting you with a man-in-the-middle attack. They wanted to make it look as legitimate as possible because that was their key, is they were trying to steal it without anybody even being the wiser. And in many cases, they were very successful at doing that. And sometimes they basically went through so good at it that they were actually targeting a lot of the VPN endpoints that people set up to VPN into their network. So they would actually either set up that initial fake one, get on the network and steal legitimate certs, but they would actually set up endpoints that look just like their legitimate VPN endpoint. So you would actually be VPN into the attacker's controlled network to get into your own network, which meant they were actually getting those valid valid credentials to get onto the network. But people felt safe. I mean, when people get into their VPN, hey, I'm happy now. That's my safe spot. They weren't thinking that it was a fake VPN endpoint because these guys had impersonated it so well. And that's the scary part, is they sort of raised the game and really did a much more interesting attack to, trick people into giving away their data, their valuable credentials. So, I'd like to say there was an easy solution to this. I don't think it's going to go away tomorrow because, as I said, as people see this, the peers keep upping their game. They keep wanting to do things that other people have already done. One of the basics is, obviously, if you have a registered account, make sure you have strong credentials on it. Have two-factor if you can. That sort of depends on who your registrar is. Some people offer it, some people don't. But the more you can secure that account, the better you are. The more you can monitor that, if you get a multi-factor, that's great. Just monitoring it to see if it's changing. Is my IP address being redirected to a new IP address? Because it's not an easy task to do, because some of these attacks we've seen, especially with Sea Turtle, they would redirect it in a very small window. They may have redirected it for 5 or 10 minutes, and then they switched it back to the legitimate name server. So they were really doing some very targeted, short-term attacks to gain what they were trying to gain. But the biggest thing is, keeping the systems patched, age-old thing, we talk about patching all the time. But the main thing is, don't take DNS for granted. We have to have it to run our networks, but you need to start looking at DNS. Monitor the activity. See what's happening, just because that's another one of those key data points. Just like the logs on your network, DNS is becoming that vital log that you can't forget. You've got to look at it to see what's happening, because it's always going to give you an indication that maybe it's another vector that the attackers are using to try and get into your network. So with that, I think we're pretty much done. Hopefully it was useful and enjoyable. We'll be around. You can ask us any questions you have anytime. Just hit us up at the booth, whatever. See us walking around. Happy to talk about this. I'll go ping Warren, make him answer all the questions. With that, I'll let him switch us on, because I think we're going to the next talk.